Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well and making it through this crazy time we are in, especially in healthcare. Now, I know that we're all kind of working at different timelines based on everything that's going on, but roughly you should be, in terms of content, looking at the module on data, the scientific method, PDCA cycles, and data visualization. Some of you I know are already kind of working into the next measurement section as well. So I think that I know that this content is still relevant though, as we consider the next two modules as we move forward. So hopefully, again, if you've already gone through some of this, that this will be a little bit of a refresher and also make you just think a little bit more deeply about how we're measuring or how you're measuring in your organization. So the first thing I want to talk about are KPIs. Probably a term that you are familiar with, but if you're not, KPIs stand for key performance indicators. These are the metrics that organizations are tracking on a regular basis. These are the things that are important, quantifiable metrics that we're using to improve our performance to align with strategic and operational goals. Now, these can and should change over time, but what we typically see in healthcare is that we have KPIs that seem to be perpetually discussed day after day, month after month, year after year, with little to no real significant movement or change. So we're going to go through a little bit of what is the difference between how we think about what are really relevant and meaningful KPIs instead of just metrics that we throw up and discuss because we feel like we should, because that's what everybody else is doing in healthcare. So again, in the next couple of modules, as we start to talk about average length of stay, as we look at turnover and occupancy rates, like these are important things. Absolutely, we do want to keep an eye on. They are very high level operational metrics. We need to understand as we look to improve these things, what are the smaller components or process metrics that are actually going to move the lever on some of those bigger things. This is where a lot of organizations fall short, especially when it comes to value-based reimbursement. We've got these like high-level incentives that we're working toward, but figuring out how we bridge the gap between these high-level metrics that we are incentivized to achieve and the smaller steps that we have to take to get there. That's a big opportunity. And I hope in this course and through some of these discussions, you'll start to recognize and see opportunities to do this within your organization as well. A few key suggestions when it comes to KPIs, they should be grounded in what we call SMART metrics. So our KPIs should be very specific and measurable. Our goals should be achievable, right? Are our KPIs, do we actually have targets, or do we just look at the numbers and discuss whether we're doing better or worse? We should absolutely have targets that we are striving for, and those targets should be bound to some sort of due date, right? They should be time bound. That is the T in our SMART metrics. And that is often the piece that is missing, right? We have metrics that we're looking at, but do we know exactly what we're trying to achieve and by when? That is important for allocating the necessary resources. It's important to make sure that people are motivated and have their eyes on the things that are truly important to us. So again, we're all making decisions each day that are in alignment with the organization and the path forward. I see that this is another big opportunity for those of us working in healthcare to do a better job here. We need more rigor, and we also need to build consensus with a team about what are here that says KPIs, we should have a limited set of metrics, less than 10. I would even argue that it probably should be less than that, especially at the department level. Having 4 or 5 metrics or targets that you are working toward over the course of the next few months or the next year are really critical, again, to aligning everybody toward a common goal. A few other notes, we usually want to express these as percentages, averages, or ratios, sometimes raw data, depending on what we're looking at. Our population base can change, other factors can change, so we want to make sure that we are doing apples to apples comparisons across time. And again, it's really important to look at the data over time, over the time horizon. Another pitfall that I see a lot in healthcare, especially with people who maybe have clinical backgrounds who have not necessarily had a lot of statistics classes or really kind of thought critically about how are we looking at measurement over time, is that we see point-to-point comparison. So if we're looking at patient satisfaction on an inpatient floor, really we should be looking at this over a horizon, and we actually want to map it out. So the reason for this is because if we are looking at like, okay, we did better than last month, everybody celebrates, that's great. And then the next month you dip back down and then morale drops, and somebody's pointing the finger and saying, what happened? You guys had this bump up. With all data, there is a normal amount of variation in the data. So this is something called statistical process control. And Edwards Deming, who is a management guru who really helped set the stage for manufacturers and then other service industries to start thinking critically about how are we measuring performance, was a big advocate for statistical process control and saying that we need to know what is normal, what are those normal peaks and valleys, and then if we see a major increase, in, let's say, patient satisfaction is a direct result of some implementation or change that we made, that is cause for celebration, and we want to celebrate those things. But if arbitrarily we see the numbers jump from 1 month to the next, and we're really not sure about, is that a significant improvement or not? We need to understand the data, and the only way we can do that is to really track it over time and to monitor it, and to also kind of put upper and lower control limits on it. We're not going to cover that in depth in this class, but if you were ever in the position where you're looking at data and you want to try to figure that out, please come to me. I'd be more than happy to help you figure out how to do that for your data set. But really, the bottom line of all of this is that the data should be helping us understand what actions we need to take next. So when we're considering kind of lean philosophy, there are two types of what we call problems or gaps. So a problem is a gap between what's currently happening and what your expectation or your desired outcome is. And so there are two ways to think about this. One is when we have done here, if current performance is not meeting our target, that's a cause gap. That means, okay, we have a set level. We know that we want to achieve, let's say, 90% patient satisfaction on all of our inpatient floors. And, we're having a couple that are significantly lower than that, right? We know that the bar has been set. We're not achieving it. That's something that we have to work towards. That's what we call a cause gap. Now, if you get to the point where you are a high performing organization, all of your inpatient units are hitting, 90% patient satisfaction, then it's, reason to have a conversation about, do we want to raise the bar? How can we get even better, right? This is this notion of continuous improvement. And maybe it is not raising the bar for patient satisfaction, but maybe it is really thinking critically about the time a patient is admitted to the time they arrive on the inpatient floor and figuring out, okay, we have a goal for this, but we know that we are strapped, patient flow is an issue, and we need to remove, reduce that even more. You can raise the bar, but we want to know what we're doing, right? Are we not meeting our baseline expectation, or are we raising the bar for ourselves? It's really important as leaders to make that differentiation. So this is at the heart of it, and I talk about this within the module as well. We need to be mindful of process versus outcome metrics. Outcome metrics are those very high level things that we're looking to achieve. If you are working in a hospital, one of the things you may hear about is the interest in reducing length of stay. It seems like it is always a point of conversation. It's a strategic objective, but that is a massive and very high level outcome metric. So we can't really snap in at a department, at a team level to understand what are the things that we're doing that are actually going to move that number, because it's so big. There are so many different factors that influence it. What we need to identify are process metrics. What are the smaller things that we can do at a local level that should theoretically influence that outcome metric? So an example of this could be, let's say, again, let's just use the example of patient satisfaction. So our outcome metric for the unit could be our patient satisfaction scores, really high level, right? There are a lot of things that can influence that. As we consider our process metric, one of the things that might be a process metric would be how frequently we are doing patient rounding, or how quickly we respond to a patient request when they, if they hit the nurse call button. Now, balance metrics are things that we want to ensure we're also keeping track of. So as we work on these things, there aren't unintended consequences. So in the case of patient satisfaction, if our process metric is making sure that we are, let's say, responding to patient calls within, 1 minute, a balance metric might be staff morale, staff satisfaction, right? Are you in a position to be able to do that? And does this metric kind of create additional barriers or issues for you in your workplace? So it's always important to kind of be thinking about these three levels when we're thinking about our KPIs. What is that high level thing we're working to achieve? What are the smaller metrics that we can really track and monitor and see if they are influencing that higher level outcome metric. And again, how are there balance metrics that we should be considering as we strive towards these things? And again, going into this level of detail and rigor, it helps, I think, make sense of the fact that we should not have 20 KPIs on a dashboard that we're trying to work towards, because doing this and doing it well requires a lot of discipline. It requires a lot of focus, and it requires a lot of communication with a team. So make sure to give yourself and your team enough time to really do this well. When we have those metrics that are very clearly defined, again, that's where we can move into PDCA, plan, do, check, act cycles. This is where, again, we want to follow the scientific method in everything that we do in leadership, and especially in healthcare. We need to improve stability in the organization. And once we create that stability with our teams in terms of these are our processes, these are our baseline metrics and our targets that we want to achieve. Once you have that stability in the process, then you can start thinking really, again, really critically about what's one thing that we can do that we think would have an impact on our process metric. So if you've got, again, if you're thinking about patient satisfaction and you're looking at frequency of rounding, is there maybe a new mechanism that can be utilized to ensure that communication to the team members happens in a more seamless way, right? So you might say, okay, well, we're gonna implement this process where a nurse call comes in, and whoever's at the nursing station immediately notifies the nurse on the care team for that patient. I'm making this up, right? But you want to identify one thing that you're going to change, one hypothesis. If we do this one thing, what do we think the improvement is going to be on that process metric? Now, this is important because this is a piece that a lot of people miss, is that when you're implementing a change or trying something new, experimenting, say, we're just going to try it and see what happens. If you just try something, you will invariably see what happens, but you won't improve your critical thinking. You won't improve your ability to kind of scientifically understand and improve a process. Instead, you're just kind of winging it, right? We want to be so disciplined that we say, we think if we implement this change that we are going to see a 50% reduction in the time from a patient hitting nurse call to the time that a nurse arrives, right? You want to get that specific, because when you do, it forces you to think more critically about the data that happens as a result of that experiment. So if you find that that there was maybe a slight improvement, but it wasn't to the extent that you were expecting, it helps you go through and understand, okay, well, what happened that only made it, just a, 10% of, more effective in terms of the time to respond to those calls. And then once we understand that, is there a breakdown in communication somewhere? Is this process not working exactly how we had anticipated? This is the check part of PDCA. And actually Deming, who was an advocate for this model, went back and, changed it to PDSA much later on, because he recognized that people were, really thinking it was just checking a box. We need to understand the data. We need to go to Gemba to understand what are the barriers with this process, right? Talk to the people who were involved with it, what worked well and what didn't. And then once we've studied and understood what actually happened, then we're going to go back and we're going to make an adjustment, or we're going to change something based on what we've learned, right? This is true continuous improvement. And instead of just doing it one time, what we see is that then one experiment leads into another, which leads into another. And this is how we actually start to move those process metrics, which again, should be moving those higher level outcome metrics. So again, that's a lot. It's a lot of work to do this really well. One thing that I want to reinforce, though, is that to do this really well, you have to be employing the growth mindset. You have to be open to the fact that things are not going to go as planned. And when we really truly think about them as science experiments, it helps take away it removes our ego from the equation to say, oh, I had this really great idea. I'm going to make sure it works. I'm going to try to make it look like it worked, even if it didn't. It's not like that. It's working as a team to come up with hypotheses and then test them. And then if we see that it didn't work out as planned, right? It's not a failure is a bad thing. It is literally a first attempt at learning. Okay, that didn't work exactly how we had planned. What happened? And how can we run a new experiment to see if we can then, based on what we learned in the last one, if we can improve upon it? This is really the fundamental part of creating a learning organization and building and developing your team. And it starts with you. It's really hard work. So practice it. The intent with this class and with these couple of modules is to get a chance to practice it. So one of the things that we often use, and when I work with organizations, is we use something called a PDCA cycles record. And this actually goes through and forces you to say, okay, what is the first step? What are we actually going to run? What's the experiment? And then what do you expect to have happen, right? What's our hypothesis? So in this example, this is in the operating room, and we're looking at items on a surgeon pick list that are constantly being returned. So we're trying to improve the supply chain. So the first step is that the team is going to track the returned items and then confirm with the physician, the surgeon, or the patient coordinator, what was returned, was it needed in the first place? Why was it returned? If we thought it was needed and it wasn't needed, kind of what's the disconnect there? And so the expectation is that by tracking this data and by having these conversations, we're going to be able to decrease the number of items on the pick list by maybe removing those things that aren't necessarily needed. And as kind of a corollary, decrease the number of returned items. So in just one experiment, after doing this with just one surgeon in bariatric services for one day, there was a number of learnings, right? In one case, in the seam guard, the number on the item and on the preference card were different. So the wrong item was actually brought in, which is why it was returned. And this had been happening for months and nobody recognized it until they actually kind of went through and ran the experiment. They did recognize, though, that there was another item, a Clear Max, that was frequently not used and returned. So trying to have more conversations around that. There were some items that were substituted. Another item, the Toomey syringe, not used and returned, right? So really a lot of things that they identified. So what did they learn as a result of all of those things? So nurses believe wrong item is picked. The nurses remove the product from the center core because they visually ID the item by the box. So really trying to understand what are the barriers, right? Are there labeling issues? Are there assumptions that are going on that maybe aren't necessarily true? There was, again, a Clear Max on this surgeon's preference card for the procedure, and none of the nurses, none of the surgeons were familiar with it and were not using it, right? So, but it was on there. But until we ran this experiment, they did not understand or recognize that this was a problem. And as a result, it was being picked. We were ordering them, we were supplying them on the case cards, and they were constantly being returned. A lot of work and a lot of time and energy and money spent on something that didn't need to be there. So you get the gist, right? Doing one experiment and really kind of going through and having the rigor around this can help you learn so much in terms of being able to improve your process and make life easier for you and for your teams. So again, as we're thinking about it this week, really think about what are those KPIs? Are they outcome or process metrics? If you have a listing of all outcome metrics, how can you actually go through and think about what are the process metrics that'll support that and what are maybe some of the balance measures that we need to consider? And additionally, in this content, when we have the data visualization is so important. How can you take the data that you're collecting, whether they're outcome or process metrics, and create a visualization that is easy for everybody in the department to understand? At a glance, to look at something and say, okay, I understand what the target is, where we are, and I can see when we meet it over time, or I can see what the gap is in performance. That, again, that is how you get everybody to kind of have alignment around what are our true organizational goals and what do we need to do to get there. As always, if you have questions on this content or if you just want to chat, please feel free to reach out. I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you. I hope you all have a great week.